sometimes human, sometimes animal, all conceived with extraordinary imagination and a wealth of expressive detail.
Live more natural lives in their unnatural habitats.
Becoming aware of nature, of natural details, and so forth.
But whenever he can, he has to be ready to investigate the unexpected and unusual, because it may contribute to what he wants to know.
We're talking about the sorts of things that had an impact in as much as they came from one part of the world and journeyed to another and acted in the mode of impact, impulse, influence, and so on.
We want to him the man at the wheel, who hurls the lance of his spirit across the earth along the circle of its orbit.
I'd suggest that we should rather look for changing angles of vision.
An inventive tradition which was able to handle with considerable equanimity a long list of wonders.
Welcome back to another episode of Administrism. It's been a while, but I am greatly looking forward to this one. This episode, we are covering the Matsigenka, the group of people native to the Peruvian rainforest who fall under the branch of the Arawakan people. Before we get into it, I'm once again going to read off our sources. We have 7 of them for this episode, and all of our information comes from the following. Families of the Forest, the Matsigenka Indians of the Peruvian Amazon by Alan Johnson. The Poetics of Recapitulative Linkage in Matsigenka and Mixed Matsigenka-Spanish Myth Narratives by Nicholas Quen Emlen. Cultivating Spirits on Matsigenka Notions of Shamanism and Medicine and the Resilience of an Indigenous System of Language by Dan Rosengren. Sharing Sociality and Stratification, Exchange and God Parentage in the Amazon by Dan Rosengren, my mistake. Shamanism and Diversity, a Matsigenka Perspective by Glenn Shepard Jr. Pharmacognosy and the Senses in Two Amazonian Societies by Glenn Shepard Jr. And Arawakan Sacred Landscapes, Emplaced Myths, Place Rituals, and the Production of Locality in Western Amazonia by Fernando Santos Granero. And those are our resources, and kicking off, we're going to have Pythia here talk about their overbranching group, the Arawakan, and their sacred landscapes before we jump into more of the details of the Matsigenka themselves. Take it away, Pythia.
So the Arawakan, they do this really cool thing, and we kind of have it mirrored in our own culture. They emplace their myths. So their surrounding is their mythology. Now, we've seen this before, that mountain right there, that's such and such god. They do this a little bit differently. When the region that they're in can no longer carry the number of people in it, they just pick up and move that with them, which I found very interesting. Now, the way that you talk about this, you use the terms topogram and topographs. Now, a topogram is the individual feature, say that particular mountain. That would be the particular topogram. When you read the whole landscape, you now have a topograph of the entire mythology around that particular item. Now, this starts in the Inter-Potomac region between the rivers in the east slopes of Peru. So these are river-tide peoples or water-tide peoples, but they also have the mountain range for their core cultures so that they always have these different things around them to pull off of. Most of them come from a culture that has a displaced solar god. So they had an original solar god, and then that guy got his ass kicked, and now they got another solar god, which is named Yampor Ret is the first solar god, and Yampor Roar is the second solar god. And this is kind of interesting because you have this kind of a primary god that doesn't exist, kind of like a landlord that lost his land. And I find that kind of interesting. A lot of these groups will carry their myths with them such that it orients them in place. So you would have Mount whatever and all the things that go next to it. And that's how you navigate the world around you. And they will go and seek when they are traveling and moving to new places, similar landscapes, so that they can kind of work their myths back into the landscape. We do the same sort of thing by calling streets Elm Street and Maple Street and stuff like that, or we always have a St. John's Parish in a particular big city, which is just our way of navigating our own world around us before we had street signs and stuff like that. They also all practice syncretism in this group. Almost every single one of them has syncretism, and it is kind of up to date. So they've incorporated the Spanish into their mythos as it stands today. They incorporated Christianity into it. They even have, in some cultures, second Jesus, which is Juan Santos. I find this guy fascinating because the way they celebrate him is they chunk rocks at each other. And I'm not quite sure how you win this game or play this game, but the primary function, chunk a rock at a guy.
Which that's interesting because that reminds me of the film Holy Mountain by Alejandro Jodorowsky, in which it starts off with a Jesus figure that they throw rocks at. I wonder if there's a correlation there.
There could be. Where is he from?
Mexico.
Mexico. Well, there would be Arahuacans that traveled through Mexico at some point because they got all the way to Cuba. They're everywhere. It's a huge and expansive group. But everywhere they go, they resettle it, and this is like New Arahuaca. We're just going to name it all the same shit. Make a little model of it. But yeah, that was the things I found interesting about the overculture, me personally.
Which, you saying that they are tied to the water, now we can start getting into some of like their specific things, some of the things that are unique, at least from what I've seen, to the Matsigenka themselves as a people. Like, first of all, they don't use cardinal directions, which isn't entirely unique. Like a lot of cultures, their cardinal directions tend to be based on the sun and its rising and setting. However, with the Matsigenka, since they live in the Peruvian rainforest, they don't have the sun so much as a prevalent thing because they live under the canopy of the trees. And so their topography, their directions are based on upstream, downstream, to the forest, and to the river. Those are their directions. Even though, as you said, they do move around. Like when an area is spent of resources, they will move to somewhere else. They still have stayed generally in the same area for thousands of years. And this was evident by the fact that their trails through the forest have been so worn over these many, many years that the walls, that the paths along the edges of the paths actually form a V as they go down into the soil of the rainforest. So like there's this highway that has been so traversed that it has worn a V into the ground. Other aspects of their culture that I find unique. First of all, they don't use names. They don't use personal names for each other. First of all, this is a family-based society. This is a family-localized society. So while they do live in larger groups like hamlets, most of their society is focused on the nuclear family. So a mother and a father and their children. That's the primary focus of their society. They do interact with other families and everything, but it's very isolated. They're very small communities. What tends to have brought them together in recent years was schooling, which even then is not like a big focus for these groups of people. They do attend school, but it's not something that, they feel the need to go to all the time. But they don't, because they are a family localized society, they don't have personal names for each other. And even the names that they receive by their Spanish neighbors, their Spanish-speaking neighbors, they don't remember them. Say someone is named, Juan. He's not going to remember that he's been named Juan when he goes back like next week. Rather, how they refer to each other, since it's such a small group, is they tend to call each other by their familial relations. So it would be like, hey, cousin, or hey, brother, or hey, sister. And if you need further differentiation, like if I'm wanting to call out to my one sister, but I have two sisters over here, I would differentiate them by saying, hey, you sister who fell in the river last week. And that changes. So like they're not always going to be the family or the sister who fell in the river last week, because like the other sister could fall in the river. It's all dependent upon context. But they don't have personal names for each other, and they don't feel a need to keep them. In the ethnography and the papers that were read, they did, or particularly the ethnography written by Alan Johnson, he gives them names, but he says these are just for the reader and for himself. They do not refer to each other by these names whatsoever.
Okay, I was wondering about that.
Yeah, because they don't feel a need for personal names. So yeah, I found that really interesting, that was how they referred to each other. One of the other aspects is we'll get into this kind of later when we talk about their religious and cosmological beliefs, but they classify everything as one of four things, which is either animate, inanimate, or it's animate with breath, animate without breath, inanimate with breath, and inanimate without breath. These are how they identify everything in the cosmos. They are one of these things. And if I remember correctly, the only thing that is animate and has breath are the stars.
Wait, the only thing that is animate and has breath?
Or no, that is animate and has no breath.
Has no breath.
Animate
okay.
and has no breath are the stars. So something that is inanimate and has breath or is living are plants. Something that is inanimate and has no breath or is non-living are things like rocks and water. Things that are animate and have breath or are living are things like animals, people, spirits. And then the only thing that is animate and has no breath and is non-living are the stars. But then moving on, with these people, as had been said before, the group is a family localized society. And so first of all, as it's a very small group, almost all of their labor and how they make a living and doing these sort of things are done in order to meet their basic needs. That's what the focus is on. Just food production, food preparation, doing chores around the house, creating things in order to assist with that. That's their primary focus. Actual wage labor, according to these studies, is below 3% of everything they do. So actual wage labor, them going and working for other people, is a very, very small part of what they do. They do participate in trade with local groups, particularly when it comes to farming. Their crops that are commercially viable, they do grow those and sell those outside of their community, such as tobacco or things like bananas and other fruits that are commercially viable. But most of what they produce and work for is all isolated within their community. Their gardens are their primary source of everything. That is what they're focused on. Even their hunting, they do participate in hunting, but it's not expected to bring back a whole lot. Their meat consumption, I think this study had said that through the entire year, their meat consumption would accumulate to about like a portion size of 2 hamburgers per year. That's all the meat they eat, at least red meat. Fish do play a larger like caloric intake for them, but it's still relatively small. Most of their staple crops are manioc, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a kind of, or like a tuber, like a potato.
Yeah, it's a tuber. It's a root. Yeah.
Okay. So most of their food comes from manioc and maize and pineapple and then plantain. Those are their 4 big crops. After that are papaya, cocoyam, sugarcane, yam, cacao, pigeon pea, guava, beans, and then finally coffee, which again, coffee is one that is sold outside for like trading and some wage. It's not really consumed amongst themselves. Most of the drinks that they consume, the biggest drink that they consume is manioc beer, which is made by the women. And getting into that, there are among their society gender-based roles. The men tend to do all of the farming. Well, not all of it. The women do some, they focus on specialized crops. As the ethnography put it, when it comes to farming, the men are required to grow the staple foods, while the women are required to produce the foods that provide flavor. So the men deal with the maize and the manioc and those things that they have to eat all the time, especially because manioc beer is one of their primary drinks. They are expected to grow that, while the women are the ones who grow the things that provide their food with something less than boring flavor.
The women also do a lot of the prep for not just the beer and the food, but in the ritual setting. So when they would make a ritual brew, the women did that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the other divisions of labor, women are expected to take care of things within the home. And one thing that is almost entirely women's work and what they are expected to do is the creation of clothing, which is they grow the cotton and they are the ones who take the cotton and card it and then spin it into thread and then make the clothing. And because it is such a time-consuming process and they do most of it by hand, almost all the downtime that exists within a day, a woman spends just idly making and spinning cloth. That's what she does.
At one time, that was true for most European women, too. A lot of European women, too. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's like when someone like goes out, it's considered, if a woman does all of these things, like since it's her primary work, this also like shows like this is kind of a reflection on her worth as a member of the group, like how well her family is clothed. So like one of their forms, or one of their kind of their big forms of clothing is kind of like a poncho. And you were considered wealthy or doing well off if each member of your family has 3 of these. One of them as kind of like a special occasions thing, one as an everyday thing, and then one as in case it needs repairs, like as a replacement. Like these are your 3, and each one of those takes hundreds of hours of work. So being able to say that, yes, each person in my family has 3 of these, that shows that you're very well off and that you're a super productive member. But then she also does the taking care of children, but as we will see, the raising of children within this society is structured in such a way that it imbues the individual with the idea of individuality. When a child is born, the mother takes the child, and like the child is immediately bathed in almost scalding hot water, which kind of gets into a religious aspect. They believe that very, very hot water cleanses the person. And so like if someone's stung or bitten by a rattlesnake, or they are feeling as though they have come into contact with evil spirits, they are ritualistically bathed in scalding hot water. And they believe that bathing a child in scalding hot water helps accustom them to the brutality that is life.
With the child rearing and pregnancy stuff, that is where their culture is the strictest and most conserved on the rituals surrounding that, because of their belief in how the soul binds to a body. So it's not just an issue of acculturation. It is, but they believe that your soul can walk out as a baby, and they got to lock you in there. So babies are highly protected individuals in these cultures.
Well, and pregnant women as well. Like there aren't a lot of food taboos. Like the biggest food taboo is they don't eat snakes. Snakes are never eaten. Snakes are the big evil of the forest. They do not eat those. One of their beliefs in spirituality is the fact that every animal is kind of ruled over by the big spirit of that animal, and that big spirit is the mother spirit of all of those. Every single snake has a mother snake spirit, and so if you kill a snake, they believe that snake's like siblings will come after you. And so in order to protect themselves, anytime they kill a snake, they just immediately huck its body into the river to keep it as far away from them as possible. That's one of their very few food taboos, which is not to eat snakes. But when it comes to ritual and other food taboos, pregnant women have a lot of them. They're not to eat red meat. They are, also pregnant women and women who are going through puberty have the same eating taboos. So they should not eat armored fish because their feet will crack. The certain larvae they cannot eat because it will cause either their mouth or their children's mouth to rot and become foul. If they eat a specific kind of fish, then she or her child will fall and break their back because that fish has a very soft back. They can't eat peccary because she will have a difficult birth or her child will kill her. They can't eat fish with teeth because they or their child will become ill. Should not eat everything that she is given, but should give part of it back as a lesson in restraint and generosity. So outside of pregnancy and puberty, these food taboos do not exist. When a child is raised, they are like once they're born, they get that ritualistic bath, and then they're immediately swaddled, and they kind of, in order to start imbuing that individuality, they don't attend to the child really whatsoever unless it starts making a fuss, right? So if it starts crying, the first thing they do is they attempt to breastfeed it. If that doesn't soothe it, then they will try and coddle it. And if that doesn't work, they don't do anything. They just let the child cry. But as Alan Johnson had pointed out, during all of his years studying there, most children didn't cry longer than 5 minutes using this treatment. This individuality is further put onto the children, especially once they become toddlers. Once they become toddlers, they go through a period of temper tantrums, especially if the mother has another child. If the mother has another child, that attention is no longer given to the toddler because they are expected to become self-reliant. It's, okay, well, you can get up and go do the thing that you want, go and do it. And it mentions that there are children who will go through months and months of just constant tantrums, and no one in the family, no one in the group even acknowledges the child. The one example that this guy gave was that he had gone back to this village and there was a child that was crying in the background, and he had brought up, like, hey, aren't you going to do something about that child who's throwing a tantrum over there? And the villager's response was, what child?
Yes.
Because they had become so used to this child just screaming all the time, they just completely blocked it out.
Remember that when you visit your friends with kids. They can't hear that shit anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the only example, like, of children becoming, like, destructive during this that he gave was there was one time that a toddler threw such a tantrum that he burned down his house.
Sounds very on brand for toddlers.
Yeah, the child just burned down the fucking house, which building the house takes months. Like, this is not an easy task. Like, they have to, because as you had mentioned, resources are relatively scarce. And so in order to build a house, like, the the guy has to go up into the mountains in order to get these particular leaves that they cherish for rooftops, and he can only bring down like 40 leaves at a time, and it takes like 90 to 100 trips back and forth up this mountain in order to get everything for a house. So to have your house destroyed by a toddler having a tantrum is not great. With your children not having been soothed and everything, this individuality is so pervasive through the society that it's also, if a child or if a woman wants to have an abortion, that's her right. It's her right as a mother to have an abortion. If she doesn't want the child, she can. And while they do know of abortifacient plants, very rarely do they use them because they want to have children as a general rule, and they want to raise them, but like sometimes things don't permit it. Like when it comes back to their spirituality, if they believe that they've been impregnated by a demon, like they'll want to get rid of that. But even after the birth of the child, they do participate very rarely in infanticide, where if the child cannot be coddled, if the child is too much of a burden on the mother or the family, they will throw the child into the river. Or there was one example that was given that the infant had its head cut open in order to, like, out of frustration by the mother, and the ethnographer and his team were able to treat the child and like bring it back to health. And within time, the mother had taken back the infant and raised it in health. But being a mother and taking care of your children, this is a very individualistic thing. What decisions you make for your children are your decision. It is the decision of the individual. And this goes into the having a temper thing. After the toddler period, where the children no longer have that sense of entitlement to their parents, once they grow out of that, at about like 4 or 5 years old, this society, the Matsigenka, starts treating these children as adults. They very firmly believe in self-reliance, and that self-reliance goes so far as to like making assumptions, right? So they won't help you unless you ask for help, because they believe that you can take care of it. Alan Johnson, again, he had described his first time walking through the rainforest, and he was struggling, dealing with everything. Walking through, he kept stumbling and things like that. Nobody stopped to help him because he never asked.
Yeah.
And this goes into like eating things too. I'm going to quote here from his section on family life. When I asked men why they avoided certain foods, for example, they often responded with, "My father didn't eat it, and I never learned how." This answer refers to more than taste. It implies an ability to tolerate foods that might harm others. For example, when one family got sick after eating a fish liver that they had received from another Matsigenka woman, she asked her why she hadn't warned them that it could make them sick, and the woman replied, "Well, it makes us sick too, but we thought you knew how to eat it." So what they learn from watching and from requesting help. But if you don't ask for help on how to do anything, they assume that you know how to do it. And this gets into their spiritual beliefs. Their spiritual beliefs, they don't believe that anything is that is earned by luck or through practice. They think that it just comes to you through good medicine. You can't practice shooting a bow and arrow as a male, as a hunter. Like, this isn't something you practice, because during the studies or another ethnography, it was shown that their arrows aren't particularly consistent. Like, they're not great, but since they tend to shoot them within such close proximities, that doesn't really matter, right? Like, they're not shooting for total accuracy. And so because of that, it's not really something that you can practice doing.
What they're shooting would be in the tree above them, and this is typical of a jungle. So you're not shooting far distance because the prey thinks you can't get it. So you don't have to shoot very far when it's a jungle environment. And that's right. Why they don't have to be accurate.
They do use a slingshot, but most of that is just kind of like to pass the time. Like they will shoot at just flying birds, and they will like or take those birds and then eat the meat. But like generally it's not, using a slingshot is not done as a primary source of hunting. But like I said, the meat is not a huge part of their diet. It's maybe like 16 ounces a year, I think, is what was given as kind of an average. So it's not a big part of their diet. They'll use a slingshot and things like that. But again, this isn't something you can practice. They don't believe in luck. They don't believe that anything comes to you because you practice it all the time. It's just something you learn. It's something you learn through being shown how to do it. And then once you're shown how to do it, it's expected that you know how to do that now. And unless you continue to ask for advice or whatever, I learned this from my parents, and that's how I learned how to do it. And since I know how, I don't need to ask anyone. So it's assumed that you are self-reliant. Everything is based on this assumption of self-reliance. And so like this even comes with things like sickness. If someone is terribly sick, they're given their food. The people in the group know that the sick individual can't go out and get it for themselves. So they give them the food. But then other than that, they carry on with their daily life and they ignore everything because they assume that that person is self-reliant and can do it on their own, which is a political thing that I kind of wanted to touch on. I've seen it a lot, that individuality only exists within capitalist societies or whatever. No, this is in stark contrast to that. This is not a capitalist society whatsoever, and they very, very strongly believe in individuality. Even so, like, they have personal property. They, like anything they make, they know, they keep a mental inventory of things that are theirs. They do share them, yes. If someone says, I have 3 needles, they know that they possess 3 needles. But if one of them is missing, their first reaction is, okay, I want to know who took it, or I want to know who borrowed it from me, because they still believe that theft is something that is morally wrong. But as long as you hey, I need to use this, that's fine. They have no issues with sharing it and sharing resources. It's just they do believe in personal property, and they do believe very strongly in individuality and the will of the individual. That generosity and giving and reciprocity are very important things that hold the community together. They are their own people, and they are raised from infancy to believe that they are their own people. And they even think this individuality is so ingrained in them that they see that on the outside too. Like if say the resources that you had brought up are running thin, like if they didn't catch many fish, it's not because they've depleted the resources. They believe that the fish are hiding.
Clever fish.
Yeah.
So they are also not alone in their region. They have other cultures around them, and they do something that's kind of unique to them when it comes to dealing with, we'll just say, white people now. Did you read up on the godparent system that they developed or they hijacked?
I don't remember much of it, no. I do, like you mentioning white people, I do remember a bit of their mythology on the creation of white people,
that shit's funny.
I will save that.
Yeah, that shit's funny. And I don't disagree. So other cultures, they would try to integrate, and then they found that they were losing their original culture, or if a person that was a Spaniard was to come join their group, that they would gain no benefit from that exchange. And what they did instead was to hijack godparenting, which I think is this very clever system. So we have godparents in the Catholic faith for the most part. Some other groups have it too. And that's where you are responsible for someone else's kid. You would be there for their dunk in the water and their confirmation and you also had to help raise the kid.
Well, and it's primarily seen like godparentage as like you are making sure that child remains steadfast in the faith.
Yes, and you take over if the parents die. So
yeah,
if they are in a family situation where the parents die and no one else in the family wants to take over, you are now their parent. So they use this system as a way to get commodities into their little hamlets. If they need a chainsaw, they would go to the next closest town, find a vendor, make friends with them, ask them to be the godparent, assuming that the vendor is a Spanish Catholic. They would be obligated to probably say yes. And at that point, now there's family exchange. So there's not this commerce aspect of buying things from them. You are kind of expected to help your family. And in doing that, they're able to benefit from the outside culture without losing their inside culture. And I found this funny. I would like to know how it goes for the vendors when you've got 20 god kids under you.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, instead of integrating, they're like, well, we're going to join your church and now you're part of our family because we had a kid and you kind of like them. That is just one of the most clever ways to preserve your culture I've seen in any of our documents so far.
And as far as like preserving the society, I'm looking for this one quote that was actually totally brilliant. It was talking about how when missionaries would come and try and teach to the Matsigenka, quote, the Matsigenka permits neither repression nor criticism. Should someone, even the missionary whose moral authority he recognizes, try to orient, correct, or prevent his behavior, the Matsigenka departs immediately with the phrase, "Here one can't live, nothing but gossip and rumors. I'm going to where no one will bother me, and I will bother no one."
Fuck you guys, I'm going home.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So like that, they syncretized that religion, but it was never impressed upon them. It was more for they did those things in such a way that it benefited them. If it didn't benefit them, they took their ball and went home.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the fuck out of that. Yeah, and with the origins of other peoples, you have the origin of themselves. They believe that they were the first people that existed throughout the world, and that their primary deity, Tassarinsi, who is... So with their cosmology, they don't believe really in dualism. Like, nothing is either purely good or purely evil. Everything exists on a spectrum. Their primary deity, Tassarinsi, who is mostly good, is still a trickster deity. Like, he's still done things for the detriment of the society, but they believe that Tassarinsi made them in large numbers, and they were already adults, and they did so by blowing upon the balsa tree.
Yeah, they came from balsa wood. So they envision themselves as being of balsa wood, which is a little different than what we're used to hearing about, made of clay and shit like that.
Yeah. And there's another group of people, the Chanchate, a tribe of cannibalistic people who were created by a demon. They live far away, about 3 months' travel. They kill people and eat them roasted. There are another group of killing bowmen who were created also at the work of this demon. He made them by blowing upon the violent ants of the Kanay tree. But then the one that I had mentioned earlier, the Viracochas, or the civilized people, quote unquote, or whites, were also created by this demon. Originally, there were none on Earth. The spirits called Ikakuna were excavating for the brilliant ore of the metal gold, silver, or other precious metal. One day, while they were busy at work, the Viracochas started poking their heads through an opening in the excavation because the demon had created them in the underworld, and the Inca-Cunas shoveled dirt furiously to stop up the hole and keep them from coming up, but they pushed with such force from below that they were unable to contain them, and they came up in vast numbers. Then Tassarinsi, who did not wish there to be Viracochas, blew from above, and out of the air fell a cloud of arrows that killed almost all the Viracochas. The shafts of those arrows were from a species of Caña Brava. Tassarinsi told the Inca-Cunas not to dig there anymore so that no more Viracochas would get out, and they obeyed. Still, however, many more Viracochas climbed out of that same hole. And another version of the story that he was told gave a more clearer issue. The shaman told the people, "Do not fish, the whites will come." But they disobeyed him, and once one white was caught by the hook, the others began to follow him out of the water in greater and greater numbers.
Or like fire ants.
Yeah, kind of.
So, they also would have told the story in a particular style, like their poetry. They note in their language when they are telling the tales and the stories and the mythologies and stuff with recapitulative linkage. And it is to reiterate the prior things said in the narrative by saying it again in a slightly different way. And this is their form of poetry. So this ethnographer, while listening to the story, he would be able to discern that this is a mythology story because the way that they would recount this is almost song-like, almost poetry-like.
Okay.
Yeah, that's from Nicholas Emlen. It gives a rhythm to it, and so, what was the example? She was going to the river to go get some fish. She was fishing in the river, and she caught a fish. So that first part where it's recapitulated, that is the telltale sign that we're having story time right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and that kind of reflects on some European aspects of story time, where I know that within certain Northern European storytelling, there existed a certain way that you told stories, that things were done in metaphors, and once these metaphors started popping up, you knew that it was story time.
Yeah. So they would signal that, okay, we're going into this version of speaking.
One thing that has shown up through these stories that we have mentioned so far, one thing that I think is important to bring up, because it has a correlation with other cultures, particularly ones in the West, are linguistic development. One of the things that is incredibly important is the breath, right? So it's already been mentioned that things are either breathing or not breathing. And the big deity blew upon the balsa wood tree, and that's how it had come about. Breath is super important and shows this kind of like, by breathing, this exhibits soul, this exhibits spirituality. And this same thing can be seen in the English language as well, like the word spirit coming from a word meaning breath. So like inspiration comes from the word breath, like it's that spear part exhibiting breath. And the word for their religious experts, let me see if I can find it really quickly because I'm terrible at remembering these things, but it stems from the word breath. It's seripigari, coming from the roots seri, tobacco, piga, meaning to hallucinate or inebriate, and with a Semitic connotation to pega, which is to transform. So the seripigari is one who inebriates himself with tobacco and transforms himself. However, one of the big aspects to the seripigari's work is blowing tobacco smoke or blowing on top of people who are seeking spiritual wisdom or spiritual healing, where was the one aspect? Because it was, I can't find it right now, but it had said, like, when you are speaking to someone, or if someone is sick, one of the responses to how they would, or how they got sick, was asking, who blew that? Like, that aspect of breath and breathing is, within their cosmology, a very inherent part of what makes you a living, soulful being.
Yeah.
Here it is. I found it. So the Saripagari's breath is believed to be charged with sacred energy that is enhanced through the use of tobacco smoke, hence the healing practice of blowing tobacco smoke over an afflicted person. As Madison in 1954 notes among the Piro, whenever a death or serious illness is mentioned, the question is quickly asked, who blew?
And this importance on tobacco will be conserved all through the Americas. Like, it is not a casual thing like we use it now. It is considered wholly, like, straight across the board before the 1400s, which I find fascinating, because we just smoke and think nothing of it. We just as if we were to eat a bowl of cereal, we have a cigarette. But this holiness of the tobacco is something that we could probably stand to look at a little closer.
Yeah, and there was another paradigm that I had worked in the past that revered tobacco, and within that paradigm was the belief that the tobacco had its own spirit, and this spirit was to be, before using tobacco in any ritualized sense, you had to appease to the spirit, and it was by using tobacco profanely and using it in a way that is not giving it the respect it deserves, and so, like, not using it in a ritual setting, that is the cause of every physical ailment that comes upon the individual. So, like, things like lung cancer, high blood pressure, and all of this shit, and heart disease, whatever, comes through the profane use of tobacco, not by tobacco use itself. It's through disrespecting the spirit, and the spirit of this plant is what comes back and tells you, like, you were not treating my shit with the respect it deserves.
I like it.
Yeah. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, coming from the occultist viewpoint of, approaching things with the respect they deserve and treating them that, like, by giving the plant its ritual space, like, you're not going to use it profanely. You're not going to use it all the time, because everything has to be set aside for this particular reason. And so that's going to force it within you moderation and walking the middle path and shit, and not using anything excessively. And through that moderation, you're not going to be smoking 2 packs a day that will lead to lung cancer, because you're only going to use it within a ritualized standpoint. So you're not going to fuck up a relationship with that spirit, and it's not going to come back and bite you in the ass.
I wonder if there's something profoundly wrong with our culture that makes us run to excessive use of certain inebriants. There's got to be a connection there somewhere.
Well, I mean, yeah, there was that like, what, fucking rat paradise experiment that was done, where the rats were given cocaine water, and as long as all of their needs were met and everything, they rarely ever used it.
No.
But when they were put in a situation that caused any stress, that's when they went and did it. And so you can look at our society as, having all of these stressors and things that, like, this disconnectedness from community, and, like, the lack of feeling of importance, and all of these different factors that weigh upon you as an individual and on the collective soul is coming together. And it's like, okay, well, I need to escape from this because I'm not able to seek satisfaction through typical means, so I'm going to find it through this inebriation.
Yeah. So
yeah, you could see it like that.
Yeah.
Continue.
So, as you were saying, the religious experts, the tobacco men, that's basically what our show focuses on. We talk about the other aspects because they're interesting and fun, but the religious aspect, we've got this person who is doing the communication with other spirits. Sometimes we call them shaman, but that's not what they're calling them. I forget the word. Started with an I. They have
the ones that were given in here were the God damn it, I just lost it too. The name they had given in here, there were the the Sapirigari.
Sapirigari. That's right.
According to this one, there were two classifications. There were the Sapirigari, who were the tobacco, or like basically tobacco men. But then there were another group that used ayahuasca, and they were called oh God, this is a longer word. Shinkatacharira.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Shinkatacharira was a more powerful shaman than the Saripagari. But the distinction was the Saripagari was the tobacco shaman, and the Shinkatachara was the ayahuasca shaman. However, in daily conversation, people use the word Saripagari more often and meant it to indicate the user of ayahuasca, which is by far the main hallucinogen they recognize. Saripagari is thus the best general term to translate our concept of shaman, and in Shima, it is sometimes acts as a cover term for all the various kinds. So they use Saripagari for basically everything as their religious expert.
So for them, they have set responsibilities. Now, a lot of times we like to think of these people as administering a drug or a medicine to another person. That's not how they operate. They take the medicines and then they go and do their job, which I find kind of interesting. So they go into the mind-altering state and do the work from that position. And it's a very interesting ritual. They would be locked in not locked in their house. They don't have locks, but they stay in their house. They abstain from several things, including sex with their wife. But their wife prepares maybe the ayahuasca, maybe brugmansia, which is not commonly used for very good reasons. We've talked about that on prior episodes. And in that state of ritual purity, he would take these medicines and go and talk to the spirits, the good spirits. And that is most of what he would be doing. He is out there working for healing, luring out prey to tell people where to go hunting, and defending the group from outside forces, whether they be embodied or spiritual. The most interesting thing I found was that it's his responsibility to find the new food. They don't believe in, what's the word for it? They don't believe that they produce any crops. They don't create the crops. The crops are given to them by the spirits. So whenever their crop fails, they will call in the shaman to go talk to the spirits to find the next variety that they're going to grow in their gardens. And they never think of these things as wild, nor would they really eat a wild plant. Everything they eat is pretty much cultivated as far as plants go, but they don't recognize that the plant that they're bringing in as a wild variant. And this is really important when you're talking about manioc, which is also cassava. Sometimes we call it yucca root. That shit's poisonous, and you can't just go and grab one and eat it. Even cultivated, you can't just grab it and eat it. So it has cyanide in it. When they go out to find a new crop candidate, the spirits are essentially telling them which ones have less cyanide in them. And this is completely reliant on their spiritual professionals to find these things, which I find fascinating. But what else? What did you find about their shamans, their spiritual professionals?
Most of what I had found was the fact that they're not in a similar fashion to the Kong that we covered last time, the Siripagari are not really held in any higher status than anyone else within the community. They are just respected for their ability to do it, but they're not paid really in any way. As you had said, yes, it is the Siripagari who take the ayahuasca. However, they, like, it, just because the Siripagari take the ayahuasca does not mean that it's prohibited from anyone else to do so. Everyone else is free to do so, but having the role of a Siripagari is based on your ability to contact the unseen ones, or the ones who can best assist. Another plant that they do use for entheogenic purposes is Datura.
Yeah, I called it Brugmansia, Datura. They could go either way on that one, probably. They were split off years later after the publication of this.
And with Datura, like ayahuasca, they don't have a problem with ayahuasca whatsoever, but Datura, that's the one, let's see. Most men I spoke to had tried Datura once or not at all. Their usual response was non picake, which is I am afraid. Their usual description of Datura was you take it, you run away. Many men told me about how they took Datura and lost control, running disoriented in the forest for several days until they came out of it or were found and guided back home by relatives. They regarded Datura as a poison and described it in 2 cases in which people used it to take their own lives. So for this reason, Datura is most likely to be used in a milder preparation. Leaves are typically boiled and the stem allowed to bathe in the eyes of the sufferer of conjunctivitis. A single seed of Datura may be chewed for a headache, or preparations of leaves used for fever or rubbing on bodily sores.
And this is how you know Carlos Castaneda's full of shit.
Uh-huh. Yup. Absolutely. One thing that I had learned from their practices that moving in, like, kind of segueing into the next bit of how, like, what's a practice that they have that you could incorporate into your own. One of the things that their practitioners do is find these stones, right? Their stones basically contain a spirit, and these stones are used in ritual purposes, but these stones essentially contain the spirits of things that can help or do harm. They would go into this ecstatic or Gnostic state with the ayahuasca, or in lesser cases, the ayahuasca beer, the manioc beer, or the tobacco, and they would then go through their spirit realm, which, again, poetically, I think is beautiful. They don't call it a spirit realm. They refer to it as the place from where I will return. They go into this spirit realm, and that's where they hunt for these stones. So essentially what they're doing is going into this state and then doing astral projection or something in order to find the location of a rock. And this rock contains a spirit. And going and finding this stone will allow you to, by carrying it with you, give you communication with the spirit world, or from that place which I will return at any time. So that's one aspect that I think could be particularly useful in any individual practice, and one that I will be participating in my own. And so rather than seeing, oh, this is just any spirit, you could go into this state and astrally project whatever you do, be called to a certain area, find a stone or a trinket or something from this area that you believe best connects you with the genius loci or whatever that you are working with, so that way you are essentially creating a talisman or a totem to the land of the area that you are working with. Because by going into this state, whether or not you use entheogens in your practice, or that's up to you, but going into this state and allowing the genius loci or whatever spirits or entities you are working with, and have them direct you to find a totem that you can carry with you that would create a point of contact wherever you go between what you're working with and the land that you are in with where you are going. So that way the genius loci acts, and like the place where you are centered at is the place that you return to, and everything outside is from that place you will return. So keeping that constant link, that's one aspect that I found particularly useful, and one that I will carry in my practice, and I would throw out the suggestion that others do too. From there, I think, unless there was anything that you wanted to add to your studies on the Matsigenka.
I do.
Go ahead.
It is their burial practice.
Oh, yes.
Their funeral practice. And you had said it is very difficult to build a house. When someone dies in this culture, it is common practice for them to torch their house and chunk their body in the river. Now, this seems very, very weird, not weird, but like disregarding on its surface. But what they are doing is they are deflecting the lost soul. So the disembodied soul, once it leaves the body, can become very dangerous, just like we talked about with the last episode. And to prevent them from coming back to maybe go home, they burn the house down and they chunk their body in the river, so that while the soul is separating, it's on the move. And
right.
I found this interesting because just chunking shit in the river, it's not just cloaca. It's not just the universal disposal unit like a dump. They actually have a point in putting that thing in motion to get it as far away as possible.
Yeah, I mean, like I had said, like with the snakes, they want to get that thing as far away from as possible. Because, and it's, as you had said, it's not like the all-purpose dumping ground. They have, when it comes to everyday refuse and things like that, they have things outside of their house and things where they put their refuse and where they, go take a shit or whatever. Like, they don't throw everything into the river. Like, it's just specific things they throw into the river that they want to keep away from them, such as corpses or snakes. They don't want them coming back to where they are. It's that coming back. The one of the other like demons within their belief system is the moon, and this goes back to the kind of non-duality that they practice. The moon gave birth to the sun, but the moon, even though it's like a godlike creator figure, that moon is still dangerous to humans, and the moon can grab the spirit of the dead and make them malevolent to the living. It would trap them, and it would either make them malevolent to those who are living, or it would eat them and completely destroy their existence altogether. Because within their spirit realm and their natural physical realm, there's a very thin boundary between them, and spirits from the spirit realm can cross over and become physical. And sometimes demons who exist in that spiritual realm will come over and act as shapeshifters in the form of deer or jaguars or something. Or
doppelgangers.
Yeah. And yes, doppelgangers. Like, you can go run off with, your lover into the bushes and have a good naked romp, but then you come back and find out that they were actually a demon who, by fucking them, like, it split your soul into pieces, and then suddenly you get really sick and you don't know why. There's a very thin veil between the two. This spirituality that they have, like, this also touches on their very strongly believed in individuality. It was mentioned in this ethnography that another anthropologist had mentioned that the Matsigenka don't really have any spiritual practices. And that was just patently wrong. It's just that they are so individualized in their beliefs, they don't believe that what they hold inside of them is necessarily important to other people, so they don't talk about it all that much. Like, when it comes to spirituality, they hold their cards to their chest.
Yeah. In fact, they do that so hard. Of the papers that I read, no one had met a shaman. They don't let you know about it. They hide them, or they don't have them at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all secretive. Like, it's really hard to get this out of them.
Yeah, and another aspect of, like, individuality that I had forgot to mention that comes with, like, their planting of crops. Like, this idea of individuality, again, so strong that they believe that each seed that they are planting contains its own individuality, where a seed decides whether or not it's going to sprout or not. A plant, like, while they're, clearing land for their gardens, if they come across, like, a banana tree or something, or a somewhat valuable tree that had existed there, they would say that plant just decided to grow there. Like, that's what it wanted. Like, everything within their natural world has that same spiritual will that they believe they do. Like, they decide whether or not it grows. They decide whether or not it wants to thrive, going so far as to say that a single seed of a plant has its own will.
I'm going to say that the next time I have an entire set of seeds go sideways. They just didn't want to.
Yeah, it's not that I fucked up. The seeds just didn't want it to happen.
Yeah.
So I think that wraps up the Matsigenka of the Peruvian Amazon. And again, if anyone out there listening wants to do research on their own, we will provide all of the details of our cited sources in the show notes, things like that. You can find these on your own and check them out for yourselves, fact check us, whatever. But the Matsigenka, absolutely fascinating people. I love their attitudes toward things. One thing that I had posted online recently while I was reading this ethnography was how, when they're planting things, sometimes they keep cultivars going, and when asked why they want this cultivar to just keep growing, they had said something like, "It's because I want to," or "That's just how we do things." Like, they provided no other explanation other than, yeah, that's just how we do it. Yeah, so I love that individuality that they impose on everything else, because every other plant, every other animal, just like them, has its own will and its own desire to survive. And I think that cultivating plants and letting them grow, not because of profit, not because, this one's more delicious than the other one, just because it wants to live too. Like, I think that is a very reciprocal and beautiful way of approaching your ecology. So awesome. Moving on to the next segment, like what you can do in your own self-reliance, something that Pythia and I had discussed right before recording this that I think is incredibly important, and not just important on like a personal level, but also something that has come up a lot within like the cultural zeitgeist, is right to repair and your capacity to repair those things that you have. It's very, very important that one, be able to repair those things that exist around you. And this is not just a, self-reliance thing. This is also, as is with everything, very much a political stance, because we do live in a capitalistic consumer society, and I could go off on that forever. But since I won't, and I will spare you me ranting, it is vastly and very important for you to be able to repair your own shit. Something breaks, you repair it. In the last year or so, I have been doing a lot of repairs. As I'm sure many of you know, I live on my own plot of land out in the middle of nowhere, and so we have a lot of tools out here, such as like a chainsaw and things like that, and I've had my chainsaw break. I need to know how to repair that. First of all, I don't think it's necessary to, drop an entire $300-$400 on another chainsaw when it's just one part that had slipped or broken. I can repair that, whether it's buying a new part, figuring out what had broken. And this goes for the smaller things too, like just hand tools, like a hammer or an axe or something like that. Being able to know, rather than just disposing of something because it broke in some way, but a majority of it's still perfectly useful, being able to do that thing yourself. Well, sometimes, yes, it is good to be able to reach out to your community, those people in your local area, and say, hey, I need this help fixing this. So providing economic resources and a living wage to local people to fix your engine, small engine repair. Or recently I had to have my tire replaced for my motorcycle, and I had sent the bike over to this guy locally. He owns his own shop, and he doesn't charge a whole lot. He charges himself a living wage, and he repaired that. And that's awesome. You can do that. But being able to do it yourself is also incredibly important. I don't need to send out everything to get it repaired, especially when there are groups say a car dealership who would completely fleece you and charge $400 for something that only costs $30 to make. Right to repair is super important, especially when it comes to technology and things like that. So I do believe that just watching videos on YouTube, or if something breaks, first thing, rather than say, oh, well, this is fucking broken, I need to just buy a new one. Find out what's wrong with it. And see if you can fix it yourself. So, for example, I have a carpet cleaner, and my carpet cleaner stopped working for some reason. And I took it apart. I looked at it. I found out that the reason why it stopped working was because one of the gears had slipped. And I could have just as easily gone out and bought a brand new carpet cleaner. Instead, I took it apart, and I just tightened up that gear and everything. I did the same thing with my PlayStation controller. One of the sticks had started sticking. Rather than throwing that out and causing more waste, I took it apart. I found out that there was, it had been lodged in this certain area, stuck in a certain position. So I just took a tool and poked it. I gave it a poke, and it works fine now. Screwed it back together perfectly. I don't need to go waste money on something else. It just took a little bit of my time to repair that. And you can do that with so many other things. And when it comes to objects, personally, I tend to use things more from a sense of pragmatism than aesthetics, really. So something doesn't need to look beautiful to me in order for, as long as it has a use. I could have a banged up piece of shit tool, but it does its job. I don't care how it looks. It finishes what I need it to do, so I'm going to keep it around. If it's a little banged up, so be it. If it's broken, I'll fix it until it's completely irreparable. It's going to stick around. I don't need to keep throwing away money. This is not only something that saves you within this economic climate that's not going to get any better. But it's also a political stance. Being able to express that self-reliance, similar to the Matsigenka. Just, it's my shit. I'm going to be able to fix it. I can do this. And I think that's incredibly important and something that you should take into your own homesteading, self-reliance kind of shit. So that's my spiel. And what plant do you have for us this episode, Pythia?
Before we move to plants, I want to give a less intimidating way for people to start on doing the task that you set before them.
Fair enough.
Everybody has kitchen knives. Everybody has dull kitchen knives. You can change that for like $5 and a trip to a Harbor Freight. And yeah, take your shitty kitchen knives and start there. Learn to sharpen those. Before you know it, you'll learn how to sharpen your saws for the yard. You'll learn how to sharpen a chainsaw chain. And you can fix all these things. And it's an easy fix. It seems intimidating to fix your own shit. That's mostly because we live in such a high-tech lifestyle now. I mean, I used to fix my own cars when they were still kind of easy to do that with. But start with blades. It's one of the easiest things that you can maintain in your house just to not throw something out.
Absolutely. Yes, start small. And you can incorporate like other things from, like the past episodes that we talked about. So, like, for example, we bought my dog a jacket because he has very short fur and it's starting to get a lot colder outside. And he's a giant baby. And if it's too cold, he will shiver and just lay down and shiver. So we got him a jacket. And one of the buttons popped off of it. And instead of, throwing the entire jacket away because the button stopped working and it's not going to hold on to him quite as well, I just went into my leather supplies. I found a piece of tiny leather that works as backing so that way it will hold the button in place, and then used the same snaps that I have for my leather working and applied it to cloth instead. Like, same tools, just applied the thing. Button works fine. It doesn't look perfect because, it doesn't match. Like, there's a piece of leather backing that's poking out around the buttons, but it still works. It does its job, and it keeps my dog warm. I don't have to throw more, polyester and shit into the landfill. Like, it's going to continue to serve its purpose. It doesn't have to be this big thing like as I originally described. Just like Pythia had said, you can start small. Do little things. It goes a long way.
Yep. On to the plants. So we read some plant-heavy material, and, there were some low-hanging fruit in those materials that I have not talked about yet. And I don't want to talk about them today either, because they said something out in these books that was way more confounding than anything you can say about ayahuasca. The word for any sedge in their environment is medicine. Now, if you know anything about sedges or you know anything about botanical chemistry,
assume that I know jack shit about sedges.
You probably don't put those words together, and there is a reason for them. So sedges, they are in the family Cyperaceae. They all look like grass. In fact, most people don't want to research these because they look the same. Like, you can categorize them in different flower types, but for the most part, when it comes down to speciation, you really need some top-level understanding of plant anatomy to the point that not even I can do it. And I've been doing this for 30 years almost, since I was a kid. But they do this. And when they go out and hunt for sedges, they are hunting for specific sedges. As I said before, the religious expert will go into his Gnostic state and come back with directions on where to find the next medicine, the next sedge. And those sedges are completely medicinal in this group. You might know a few that are edible, but they don't think of them like that. They're used for hunting. And they take these sedges to secure the hunt, and each individual sedge will be named basically spider monkey sedge. And you take that one for spider monkeys, or a particular fish sedge, and you take that one then. And they have all different categories. It's not just hunting, all the different medicines. They use sedges for this. I tried to do some research on the biochemistry of sedges to find out what other medicine things are there. And because nobody wants to study sedges, nobody fucking knows. Nobody knows
That's
about
fair.
this shit. And if you are a botanist and you want to be, not a botanist, let's just say a plant scientist, and you do HPLCs and do PCRs and all that jazz, you want to be secure for the rest of your life or publishing till the moment you die, go into sedges, because nobody is doing this. In fact, the one paper I found, which was a master's thesis, I believe, it was 60 pages, they ran an HPLC and they didn't even optimize the solvent gradient. So even when they're doing research on this, it is super sloppy research just to get their thesis out. And yeah, this is a big blind spot, because why? Because sedges all look the same unless you super know what you're doing. But I'll tell you this, you want to impress the fuck out of somebody who has a little bit of plant knowledge, identify a sedge correctly in front of them. That would blow their mind. But yeah, sedges, they're amazing, and nobody gives a shit about them, and it makes me mad.
Which I did find this one bit on plants in the ethnography where they talked about this. It said the complexity at which they had described plants fell into several aspects, such as the large number of specific names for plants, sort of like a species-level lexicon. There was a general absence of higher categories for grouping, such as no genera, familia, or families, etc. There's a large number of varietal names with specific categories, such as, different kinds of crops and cultivars. There was a certain degree of idiosyncrasy, such as different informants gave different names for the same plant.
Yeah.
And there was a certain amount of unevenly distributed ignorance, just saying that they didn't know. However, a broad distinction of 3 categories of plants took shape that he was able to validate in systematic interviewing. The categories were crop, weed, and tree.
And a tree could be a weed if it was growing in the crop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
it was a problem, because there's a lot of root entanglement and undergrowth, especially when they're clearing their thing. Like, they can't always pull up a tree. Like, a lot of the time they just cut it down and left the stump.
And conversely, if they were to come across the remains of a prior use garden that still had crop in it, it is no longer crop. Those are now weeds. They would not eat from that. They wouldn't even recognize those as crops. They would know that they're the same species on some level, but it would fall outside of the category of a crop at that point. It is completely contextual.
At the end of this paragraph, it says, in their view, these were not struggling survivors of some old garden, but they were wild plants that just grew.
Yeah.
And what distinguishes a wild plant from a cultigen is therefore that no one planted it, not a genetic breeding of domesticated species out of distinct wild ancestors.
Yeah, and they don't even recognize a real connection between a cultivated thing and its wild ancestors. So it has to basically get declared by the Tassarinki? No, something like that. Their beneficent god would have to declare this the new crop for them to recognize it as the new crop.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they got some wild plant stuff going on in there. I wish I could have dug in deeper.
And for anyone else listening, like I've already said, we have all of our resources, and we'll have them available to peruse. Like, you can check all of that stuff yourself. We've got the titles, names. Like, I use MLA formatting because that's just what I do. Thank you all for listening to another episode of Administrism, and As far as the next episode, we haven't got another culture lined up yet, so the next one's going to be a surprise. I will probably be posting on all of our socials if anyone has a suggestion. But we're going to find out next episode what it's going to be. So you'll have to wait for that, and we're looking forward to it just as much as you are. So thank you for listening, and we hope you join us again next time. See ya!
See ya!
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Administrism. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving us a rating or review, or supporting our efforts on Patreon at patreon.com/administrism. You can email us by reaching out to ministrism@gmail.com. Join us on our Discord server to share your own journey, participate in new magical developments, earn prizes, and more. We can also be found on Blue Sky, YouTube, Instagram, and most other places by searching for Administrism. Nika, get off me. Go lay down. Go, fuck off.